Please take a second to subscribe, then like and share afterwards. We can really use your support. Thank you. Previously on Hallowed Ground, we explored the foundation of the 2008 crash and the 7-year cycle of the Shemitah and how this mystery in Leviticus 25 connects to America. Now, we take you back to the nation's beginning, as this is incredibly important to understand before we can move beyond hallowed ground. And what we are about to discover will truly shock you. This will, without a doubt, convince you that God has been at work in our modern age. We begin this journey in the 9th century BC, in the book of 1 Kings. The foundation of the first temple was laid in the month of Ziv, the 2nd month of the 4th year of Solomon's reign, and completed in his 11th. This meant it took 7 years to complete. The Temple of Jerusalem was the house of God's glory, the place for God to dwell with his people. But in 586 BC, after centuries of apostasy and with no hope of return, the Lord finally allowed his house to be touched by judgment and destroyed. The temple was the focal point of the nation's life, so the focal point of the nation's judgment would be the temple's destruction. Therefore, as the temple would be destroyed, so too with the nation. And it goes both ways. When the temple's construction was completed by King Solomon, the kingdom itself was considered as complete. Solomon then dedicated the temple to God, and by doing so, he was dedicating the entire nation to God. On that day, Solomon gathered the nation and its leaders to Jerusalem. He addressed the gathering, reminding them of how faithful God had been to the nation. Then he offered up prayers for the future generations. Solomon was looking into the nation's future, foreseeing its coming departure from God and its consequences. He understood that it meant consequences of the removal of God's favor from the land, the withdrawal of his blessings, and the nation's hedge of protection. It would be a national calamity. The Temple Mount was the nation's ground of dedication, the very ground that stood for the temple, the city, and the nation. And as we've discovered in the first episodes of this series, a spiritual darkness engulfed the land, and the nation departed from God. When judgment finally came after a period of mercy, that judgment was complete when it touched the Temple Mount. The ground where the nation's future was consecrated to God is the same ground where the apostasy had been foretold. Now, take note. This is a critical principle. When judgment comes to such a nation once committed to God and consecrated to his purposes, but now departed from his ways, the judgment will return to its ground of consecration. Repeat, the ground of its consecration will become the ground of its judgment. And as we've seen over and over again in this series, we should expect by now that this will have everything to do with America. You bet it does. Senate Majority Leader Tom Daschle recited the words of the ancient prophecy on the day after 9/11, and during which he mentioned a number. He said,
"It is with pain, sorrow, anger, and resolve that I stand before this Senate, a symbol for 212 years of the strength of our democracy."
212 years. If we subtract 212 years from 2001, we get to the year 1789, a very significant year in American history. We all know that America was founded in 1776. That was the year America declared independence. But it would take years before that independence became a reality. America as we know it, with a president, a Senate, and a House of Representatives, only came into existence on April 30th, 1789. This was the day that the nation's government was set in place, and most importantly, the day that America's first president was inaugurated. George Washington was an American military officer, statesman, and founding father who would serve as America's first president for 8 years. We're about to see how Washington's day of inauguration and King Solomon's day of consecrating the temple are inextricably linked. The dedication of the temple was also an inauguration, and the inauguration of the American government would also be a dedication. Each was an opening day and a day of completion. They both represented the completion of a structure, the structure of a nation, and each involved the nation gathering together. This gathering would take place in the nation's capital, each presided over by the nation's leader. King Solomon began his address by acknowledging God's hand and faithfulness in the nation's history. So, on America's inauguration day, the nation's first president would do the same. In the first ever presidential address, he said, "No people can be bound to acknowledge and adore the invisible hand which conducts the affairs of men more than those of the United States. Every step by which they have advanced to the character of an independent nation seems to have been distinguished by some token of providential agency." Washington clearly refers to God with the terms invisible hand and providential agency. As he addressed the people in the days of the dedication, King Solomon offered up prayers and supplications to the Almighty, interceding for the Lord's blessing on the nation's future. Now, listen to the words of Washington's first presidential address. It would be peculiarly improper to omit in this first official act my fervent supplications to that Almighty Being who rules over the universe, who presides in the councils of nations, and whose providential aids can supply every human defect, that his benediction may consecrate to the liberties and happiness of the people of the United States a government instituted by themselves for these essential purposes. 2 leaders and 2 events almost superimposed. At the Temple Mount, it wasn't just Solomon praying for the nation's future. All the leaders and the multitudes gathered there prayed as well. So too with the inauguration. It was a designated day of prayer and dedication. This was the proclamation that went forth. On the morning of the day on which our illustrious president will be invested with his office, the bells will ring at 9 o'clock, when the people may go up to the house of God and in a solemn manner commit the new government, with its important train of consequences, to the holy protection and blessing of the Most High. An early hour is prudently fixed for this peculiar act of devotion and is designed wholly for prayer. So, on the morning of April 30th, 1789, the sounds of bells filled the nation's capital for 30 minutes, calling the people to go up to the house of God to commit the new government to the holy protection and blessing of the Most High. As for the nation's first president and government, it would be later that same day that they would gather for prayer to commit the future into God's hands, at a place especially chosen for that purpose. So, after the new president finished delivering the first presidential address, he would lead the Senate and the House of Representatives on foot in a procession through the streets of the Capitol from Federal Hall, the site of the inauguration, to the place appointed for their prayers. The place appointed was a little stone church. Let's make this very clear. The very first official act of the newly formed government took place inside the walls of a church for the dedication of the nation to God. All of the government leaders were all inside this holy sanctuary, and the gathering for this consecration was recorded in the Annals of Congress as part of the first ever joint session of Congress with an acting president. That's right, the first collective act of the newly formed government was to gather for prayer and commit the future of the nation into the holy protection and blessing of the Most High. And what location would this hallowed ground of America's beginnings be? There are no churches dating back to 1789 in Washington, D.C. That's true. And that's because Washington, D.C. wasn't the capital city at that time. In fact, Washington, D.C. didn't even exist. The capital was New York City. Remember, when we uncovered the prophecy of the sycamore tree in episode 9, we visited the area of Buttonwood that would become the area of the New York Stock Exchange on Wall Street. Here stands a dark bronze statue of George Washington. His right hand is turned downwards and in the position of resting on a Bible. This very spot is very significant. An inscription on the pedestal of the statue states, that Buttonwood sycamore tree stood only yards away from this location. Now, Washington and the leaders withdrew from Federal Hall that morning and headed on foot in a procession to the little stone sanctuary to commit the nation's future in prayer to God. And where this sanctuary is key to the mystery. It is the ground on which the nation was committed to God, the nation's ground of consecration. It isn't far away, just a few streets away, and you arrive to the corner of Fulton Street and Church Street. That little stone sanctuary is St. Paul's Chapel, the very same chapel that stands across the street from Ground Zero and saved by the sycamore tree on 9/11. It is America's consecration ground. America was committed to God and the corner of what would become total and utter destruction. George Washington, John Adams, America's founding fathers, all came here to pray on that day of America's foundation to be laid as a consecrating act of that foundation. It was here that they came to commit the nation's future to God's holy protection. And they got it for 212 years. Then it was here that the holy protection would be withdrawn. The ground of dedication became the ground of calamity. Judgment returned to the ground of consecration. But was it? Ground Zero isn't part of the church's land, thus wasn't part of the consecration, was it? Well, in 1789, no buildings existed anywhere on the compound where the buildings of the World Trade Center stood. In fact, it was all a field, and that large field was owned by the church. The entire area of Ground Zero was church land owned by St. Paul's Chapel. It was all one property. We need to realize that at the beginning of America, the inauguration at Federal Hall and the consecration at St. Paul's were two separate locations only blocks away from each other, but they were inextricably linked as one. They were joined at the founding of the nation, and they were joined even on September 11th. But how? Experts discovered, quite miraculously, that when the towers fell on that day, a shock wave was sent forth from Ground Zero to Federal Hall. The impact was so great that it opened up cracks in the foundation. Nowhere else were these cracks found, only in Federal Hall. Cracks in the foundation of the nation's foundation. Few realize that Washington's presidential address in 1789 was prophetic. In the address, the message included, "The propitious smiles of heaven can never be expected on a nation that disregards the eternal rules of order and right which heaven itself hath ordained." In other words, God's blessing and favor can never be expected on a nation that disregards what is right and wrong, which God has ordained. Like Abraham Lincoln, Washington knew that America would have to keep God's word so that the nation would not lead to a judgment. Everything that we have seen, behind Ground Zero, Federal Hall, the chapel, the sycamore, the cedar, the cornerstone, the words of the prophets, behind everything is God's calling to return. The nation must turn back to God if it is to evade the ultimate and final judgment of the nation's destruction. Up next, we come to the final episode of Hallowed Ground with the climactic converging of it all for the mystery of September 11th. Here on Prophecies Uncovered.